Good morning, everyone. My name is Danuta Nietetsky, Dean of the Drexel University Libraries. So I want to thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Breaking Polarization, the Promise and Perils of the Election Reform. This event is the final session in the library's Countdown to Vote webinar series, through which we seek to engage the Drexel community and our neighbors across Philadelphia and the state of Pennsylvania with important issues related to elections and voting in order to help navigate the upcoming presidential election. Before we begin the discussion, I want to run through a few logistics. So first of all, please keep yourself muted during the presentation. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat and we will get to them at the end of the session. We're recording today's presentation and we'll post the video on the library's YouTube channel later today. And following the webinar, all the attendees will receive an email with a link to the video and a link to a very short survey. We'd love to hear your feedback about this session and ideas for future sessions as well. I'm now pleased to introduce today's guest speakers, and we have two. Jack Santucci, Assistant Teaching Professor of Politics at Drexel University, and Lee Drutman, a Senior Fellow in the Political Reform Program at New America, which is a policy think tank. So welcome, Jack and Lee, and the screen is all yours.
Thanks, Danuta. Let's get into it. So we are very fortunate to have Lee here. Just by way of my background, I teach courses in political institutions and American politics at Drexel, and I have been involved on and off with the ranked choice voting issue for roughly 15 years, since before it was called ranked choice voting. And one big goal of this today is to introduce you to Lee's book. And there is a picture of it on the screen. I encourage you to get a copy, but you're going to get some of the main points today. And our rough plan is to just be clear about what polarization means, at least in the framework of this book, and then talk about varieties of ranked choice voting, which are being proposed as a solution to polarization. And then from there, we're going to go to a couple of sets of difficult questions about, what if we went to a multi-party system? And well, if we're scared of doing that, what if we just try to get rid of political parties instead? And with that, I'm going to put this up and let Lee tell us about polarization, just to show you what you're looking at here. This is a measure of the distance between the parties, the Democratic and Republican parties in the U.S. House of Representatives, going back to the emergence of both parties immediately after the Civil War. And what you see is that since the New Deal period, it has increased dramatically. So, Lee, what's your take on all of this? What does it mean? Why did it happen? To what extent does it sort of manifest among elites? Is that different from the way that it manifests among voters? Fill us in.
Let me just get my camera so it looks right here. Yeah, so what you're seeing there are voting patterns in the U.S. Congress, and that there's a period in the 50s, 60s, 70s in which the voting patterns of Democrats and Republicans weren't all that different. And in fact, there was tremendous overlap in the voting records. And it's just parties were kind of these, overlapping coalitions of liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans alongside conservative Democrats and conservative Republicans. And, on different issues, they had different coalitions, different compromises, and you started to see the collapse of those liberal Republican and conservative Democratic parties or factions, to the point where, all Democrats were basically liberal and all Republicans were basically conservative. Now, why did that happen? It's a complicated story, but there's three main forces driving that. One is the big one is the kind of sorting of the parties along a kind of cultural war axis of political conflict. That you can think of the liberal Republicans as kind of fiscally conservative, but like socially liberal. So they had to choose, as the Republican Party became more culturally conservative, they had to choose whether they wanted to fit within the basically adjust their cultural views to fit within the Republican Party, or kind of become Democrats, and a lot of them became Democrats or changed. But I mean, the point is that there was no home for those type of Republicans. Similarly with the conservative Democrats, a lot of them lost or became Republicans, or changed their views, and so you had this sort of flattening out of the parties, and that conflict also, worked along with a kind of urban-rural divide, because of the way of our political geography works. That the Republican Party became much more the rural traditional party, the Democratic Party became much more the urban cosmopolitan party. And as the parties changed in the national image, voters changed. Some voters changed their parties. But it became harder and harder for dissenting factions within those parties to gain any relevance, and so there was kind of a replacement element. So the parties sorted more clearly into liberal and conservative camps. It's also just a tremendous nationalization of politics. That in 1950, 1960, the adage "all politics is local" really held. That people were voting for members who reflected their local constituencies, and there wasn't so much of a calculus who's going to control Congress. And local issues were more important than national issues. A lot of important politics was decided at the local level, but a bunch of forces, most importantly civil rights, really nationalized American politics, and voters became more concerned about who was controlling Congress. And as parties became more homogenous, less diverse, it was easier for parties to send out clear messages to voters, and easier to demonize the other party as radical and extreme. And so politics became much more nationalized, which left even less space for these different local factions to be represented. And starting in the 1990s, you had this period of really close competition for the control of national institutions, which further created a polarized politics, because parties became much more concerned about winning control, and there was a centralization of party leadership, which then further added to the polarization as the parties drifted apart in their voting patterns. And all of these three big patterns kind of just fed on each other in a kind of reinforcing cycle to take us where we are, and the voters kind of came along for the ride.
That's a lot.
It is a lot.
People can ask questions about it, but I think that's a good summary of sort of how we got to where we are, which is what you see on the screen. And most political scientists would probably tell you that, 70% of voters are not as polarized as the folks that we're representing on this screen. Is that, any thoughts on that really quickly, just to clarify? Like the doom, you say there's a doom loop. What's the doom? Where does the doom come in?
The doom comes in. Hey, have you been paying attention to 2020? I mean, the doom comes in when we feel like the election would be illegitimate if the other side won. The doom comes in when we start dehumanizing the other party. The doom comes in, when we're willing to trample over norms and legitimacy and process in order to assure power. Right? I mean, democracy depends on there being some sense of shared fairness, some sense of legitimate process, where even if your side loses, still fair. But there's been, in this period of escalating polarization, there's also been escalating legislative and constitutional hardball. Where both parties, but I think especially Republicans, have pushed the limits and really tried to change the fundamental rules of democracy and of process in order to maintain power. And that is a short-term strategy for gaining power, but it's a long-term strategy for undermining the legitimacy of the process. And if you don't have a legitimate process, you wind up in competitive authoritarianism, which is not democracy, and it's a place that I don't think we want to go. And that's where we're heading, because the doom loop is escalation, more escalation, more radicalization, more extreme rhetoric. And eventually, if you think the other party is less than human or doesn't deserve the same procedural rights or is a fundamental threat to democracy, you are willing to trample on democracy in order to preserve power. And that is the way of Hungary. That is the way of Turkey. That is the way of Venezuela. That is what happens when you have this pernicious polarization. And we are, if not there, very close to there. And that is the doom loop. So, to the point about 70% of voters are not as extreme as their elected officials. I mean that is or not as polarized. I mean there's various ways to measure this polarization, and one way is to survey voters and ask them what they think on various issues. And the truth is that on most issues most voters don't really have particularly strong opinions, but if you poll them, they're certainly less coherent than the party platform, because people are independent thinkers, and and also inconsistent. Like you might poll somebody one year, they change their view. So there's sort of this sense that and a pretty consistent finding in political science for a good 60 years that maybe like a quarter of voters really have clear ideological views on politics. And then, there's some voters who are, sort of cross-pressured. A lot of voters who just don't really pay that much attention to politics and just, oh, I'm a Democrat, so I vote Democratic, or I'm a Republican, or I'm a single issue voter, I care about abortion, and the rest, it doesn't matter. Voters are more complex, but their choices aren't. And the way in which parties win is by making the other party seem more extreme and more radical or bad for your set of issues. So that leads to a sense that the other party is too extreme, which leads to a sense that they're dangerous, which means that you can't compromise. And then we get the doom loop.
So, and that brings us to the solution, which is essentially to make it easier for there to be more parties and possibly bring back the four-party system. And I'll get to that in a second. Just right now, I want to make sure that people are clear on exactly what ranked choice voting is, because you recommend a form of it in your book. And with every passing quarter at Drexel, I get more and more students showing up with prior knowledge of ranked choice voting. And when we're talking about ranked choice voting, we could be talking about any number of ways of electing people, some of which may be more likely to give us a multi-party system. Others may be less likely to give us a multi-party system. And I don't want to walk people through the math in the sort of limited amount of time that we have. But when most people come to me and say, hey, we need ranked choice voting to have more choice, they tend to be talking about something called the alternative vote, which retains the single seat district. And you still need 50% of votes plus one to win. And what that tends to do is draw minor party votes back to the two major parties. The other form of ranked choice voting, and it's the one that you recommend, is the single transferable vote, which is sort of a highly candidate-based form of proportional representation. And that uses a multi-seat district that can be bigger or smaller. The more members there are elected from that district, the easier it becomes for someone, a party or an independent or whatever, to win that seat. In the legislation that's proposed right now, we're looking at a threshold of about 18 to 25% of votes to win a seat. And that single transferable vote form of RCV supports multi-party systems in countries like Australia, Ireland, and Scottish local councils. Malta is a bit of an outlier in that respect.
Yeah. Also Northern Ireland.
Northern Ireland. So you want to add anything to that? Because I sort of want to get to the pitfalls. I just want to make sure people are clear about.
Yeah, no, I mean, you did a good job, right? I mean, maintaining single member districts is you might see more third parties being competitive and being players, but, with the single winner district, you're still going to probably wind up with a two-party system. In order to have a multi-party system, you need some form of proportionality, which means larger districts, or, there are other ways to get to that. But yeah.
So that brings me to sort of the first of two like hard questions for a lot of people, particularly on the sort of from the left to the center left. The 800-pound gorilla in the room when we talk about blowing up the two-party system is that we recreating the old four-party system, if you will, is that, and this is a graphic from your book, basically says, look, if you look at American politics, you've got four types of players. One is a sort of fiscal liberal social conservative. Another is a social conservative fiscal liberal, right? You've got all the variants right there on the screen. And the sort of big danger is that if we recreate, in a sense, the New Deal party system, right? If we put the populists back together with the progressives, that type of coalition might not have a very good record on voting rights, on civil rights, on a woman's right to choose, and things of that sort. That's a tough question. Do you have any thoughts on that sort of worry about?
Well, the world has changed. The world has changed a lot, and societal values have changed a lot since that era. So yeah, I mean, there are people in this country who have socially conservative views on race, on immigration, on gender roles, and those are held views. Now, problem is, the question is, what do you do with that, right? So now there's some of those views are more moderate than the kind of binary party system encourages them to be. Like there's just the idea that a woman should never that abortion should not be legal under any condition is really, and when you look at polling, that's really a very minority held view. I mean, there are people who are not pro-abortion, but under certain circumstances, like it's okay. But I mean, let's take the abortion issue, because actually that's a good job of illustrating. Now, the Republican Party, as constituted, has become a very strongly anti-abortion party, even though, like, in every poll I've seen, majority of people support, maybe they don't support it, they support some right to choose. But, because the Republican Party is one of two parties, there are a lot of people who, on other issues, they might agree with the Republican Party, or at least they don't agree with the Democratic Party. And because there's a plurality of people in the Republican Party who are intense religious social conservatives on these issues, they get to dominate the Republican Party. And because the Republican Party is one of two parties, they get to make policy for the entire country in many respects, or put Supreme Court, or we'll talk about Supreme Court. That's a kind of that's top of mind, but also somewhat out to the side of this. So the question I often get in these conversations is, well, what about ethno-nationalist parties? Like in a multi-party system, a proportional system, you are going to wind up with an ethno-nationalist party, right? No question about that. I don't know how big that nationalist party would be, but having looked at a lot of polling data, I would guess probably about 15%, like hardcore, white America, Christian America. That's like pretty consistent with the support for these types of parties in Western European democracies. Now, in a proportional system, what happens to these parties? Well, one of two things. Mostly they are marginalized. That there's, if that's 15% of the seats in the legislature, there's another 85% of seats in the legislature. And among that 85%, you can usually get to a majority governing coalition that doesn't include the extreme party, because most people across the political spectrum, are opposed to that. And you see that in Germany, Sweden, pick your country, you see a kind of, center-oriented governing coalition that marginalizes the extreme parties. And sometimes the extreme parties are on the left. More often these days they're on the right, but that could change. So that's one way to deal with it. Another way that you sometimes see is that these parties, extreme parties, do get to be part of a coalition, governing coalition, but they're a junior partner in that coalition, and they have to make some compromises. So policy moves to a somewhat restrictive immigration dimension, or called conservative on some dimension, but not as far as that party would like. There's some concessions made. Now, what happens? One of two things. Either that party then moderates because now it's in government, so we have to soften our view, so we're not quite as radical, or that party, as more often happens, totally loses support because the entire raison d'etre of that party was as an outsider party, and suddenly if you're compromising, you've lost legitimacy among the kind of ethno-nationalist radicals, and so then you diffuse. That's the story of the Finnish National Party. Now, in the U.S., the two-party system, does a decent job of marginalizing radical parties when they're at like 10%, because they can't get a foothold in one of the parties. But as they become closer to 15, 20%, then they become a serious faction in one of the parties. And this is what happened in the Republican Party, is that you had a rising like ethno-nationalist faction that started to gain a foothold in the Republican Party, even though it was maybe 30% of the Republican Party. But once it gained the dominant position, it got to set the vision of the entire party. And because most people are more partisans than they are ideologues, and they don't, where else am I going to go? I'm a Republican. I've always been a Republican, and this is the Republican Party, and I'll update my views. And so you wind up with a bunch of Republican senators and members of Congress who, either I'll retire or I'll become more ethno-nationalist, because those are the options in a two-party system. And so in that situation, a sort of ethno-nationalist populism gains foothold and it takes over a party, and then it's kind of game over, because you need two parties for a two-party system to work, and you need two parties who believe in compromise and governance and and basic shared values, and that's missing right now from U.S. politics. You need a moderate center-right party that believes in democracy.
There's one more. We had a couple of questions. There's one more I really sort of want to get to, and maybe we can deal with it quickly because I want to leave a little time for Q&A. But the other sort of another version of this. You're going to put the sort of racist New Deal back together. The flip side to that coin is, if you do this proportional system, the AOC party, the DSA party, is going to ramp up its seat share in Congress. And you're going to end up in this sort of Latin America 1970s situation where there are too many socialists in Congress, basically, to reach compromises with a president. That sort of argument. And this fear is kind of what leads many people to prefer the alternative vote over the single transferable vote. Do you have any quick thoughts on that before we go to sort of Q&A?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's possible that the AOC share will ramp up. But if it does, it represents genuine frustration with growing economic inequality. And the level of economic inequality that we have is really actually tremendously unsustainable for a democracy. So if that ramps up, it says that we need to do something to make our economy more equitable. That's the best way to respond to that. And the problem is that there's a sense in which neither party is. Democrats are shifting a little bit, but neither party has a real solution for what is really a politically unsustainable level of inequality in our society.
Stacey, do we have time to just briefly say why this might not be the right way to think about politics?
Yeah, I think so. We've got 2 minutes left. I have 2 questions that came in, so if you can be quick, and we can take one of the questions and deal with the rest via email afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is a myth that we have, but voters are kind of all over the place. The problem with this is that it's one-dimensional. And voters are much more complex. I mean, there are voters who are moderate, but often, like, they hold extreme preferences on different issues. And I mean, a lot of what, well, anyway, this is a lie. This is not the distribution of voters. And I think if we had no more primaries, we would have, well, I mean, I would get rid of primaries because I want parties to be able to decide which candidates they nominate.
So another way to do this is,
yeah, and we have some evidence on open primaries because they've been tried in a bunch of states, and I think that the evidence shows that this is not in fact what happens.
cool. Stacy, what do we have?
So the one question I have is, where do conversations have to happen to move towards some form of RCV in the US and at the state level? And how long would it take to educate citizens to be prepared to consider something like this?
I mean, I'll jump in really quickly. Having worked in this having basically peddled this stuff for a living at one point in my career, and when we were doing that, there was no there were problems, but the problems that seemed like they needed to be solved were not as manifest to people, and therefore people weren't ready to be educated about RCV. Now they come into my classroom already having heard of it. Lee, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. That, I mean, the part of moving to a solution is understanding the nature of the problem and why the system that created the problem is not the system that's going to solve the problem. And I've done a lot of these conversations, and I often get a question like that. Well, how do we get more people to understand this? And the answer, I guess, is just talk to more people about it. I mean, I feel like the once you understand the nature of the problem, the way that the structure of our political institutions and parties exacerbates the problems, the way that the fundamental changes in American politics have made old solutions inappropriate, there's a logical conclusion. So, I mean, it's just about spreading the word, but, at the risk of being overly self-promotional, I mean, I feel like my book does a good job of laying this out. There are shorter articles that folks can read that I've written that kind of do a shorter version of it, but, read it, share it, book clubs, or get it out from your library. I don't need to make money on this. So, yeah. Expand the conversation.
All right, I have a few more questions, but I am conscious of time. Would you prefer if I emailed the questions to the two of you afterwards and we can respond via email?
Whatever works for you.
Let's just do it now, because
I'm okay with that.
Yeah. Why don't we bundle them together?
Okay, so the one is, under a preferential ranked system, are open primaries necessary or relevant? And then the next one is, this seems really pessimistic. What are the chances the US actually adopts any of these changes, as there is no benefit to the current political elite? Is there any hope for democracy in the US?
I could take the second. If you want to take the first.
Yeah.
Well, I'll take the second. I mean, just empirically, it's very, very rare for a country to switch at the national level to either of these mechanisms unless some multi-party system already exists. We can conceive of scenarios in which a two-party system reforms itself, but empirically, they're extremely rare. And I can show you what to read on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, on the second one, yeah, I mean, it's rare. I mean, probably would start at the state level, and it's already starting at the state level with Massachusetts and Maine and Alaska. But, I mean, American democracy has had these occasional decades of significant democratic reform. The Progressive era was probably the most the memorable example in which we really changed some very fundamental national institutions. The question on open primaries, I'm not a huge fan of open primaries. I think parties are pretty important and primaries are generally bad. I would just do away with primaries and just have one general election with multi-winner RCV or single transferable vote. I think, there's a lot of enthusiasm about open primaries, but again, open primaries kind of rely on a faulty vision of what the electorate looks like.
Thank you, everyone, for putting this together.
So with that, let us thank you both, Jack, for bringing Lee to our campus into the easy Zoom way, all the way from DC. And thank you very much
for commute from my office to my office.
Yeah, for sharing some of your insights. So let's give them that round of applause that we can sort of do visually. But the other thing I do want to say is that, again, this was terrific for us to be able to contribute this to the campus's effort of bringing out the Drexel vote. And so, as somebody this morning reminded me too, it's sort of unbelievable. We're a week away from the end of this election period.
Yes, vote. Vote.
Sure to vote.
Pennsylvania matters.
Yes, it sure does. Thanks very much again.